In the Colorado mountains, a drifter was about to discover why locals whispered about Widow's Peak, what started as a routine county. Auction took a shocking turn when she came face to face with children's laughter echoing from empty stone. Ruth Calder wasn't your typical land speculator. For 35 years, she had spent her life moving from place to place with nothing to anchor her. Known for her skeptical wit and fierce independence, when she encountered the mountain's acoustic mysteries and discovered carved listening posts throughout the peaks, she had no idea she was walking into a network of hidden survivors who'd made the impossible terrain their sanctuary. Ruth's choice to climb deeper rather than flee would lead to becoming guardian of a secret that mining companies and government agencies had never suspected. What began as a $2 gamble on worthless scrubland would become a life-changing inheritance of responsibility. The forgotten children living in Widow's Peak's acoustic chambers would never be the same after finding an adult advocate, willing to protect their hidden world from a system that would scatter them across foster homes and institutions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice cracked like old leather when he called Lot 47. $2, I said, loud enough to carry across the empty folding chairs. Nobody else bothered to bid. Why would they? The legal description read like a punishment. Quitclaim deed as is under adverse conditions. To 40 acres more or less, Section 16, Township 9 North, Range 4 East, including all mineral rights, water rights, and improvements thereon. 40 acres of Colorado scrubland for the price of a gas station coffee. The kind of deal that makes you check your wallet for monopoly money. My name is Ruth Calder, and I just bought myself a mountain. Not that I knew it yet. The county clerk stamped the deed with the enthusiasm of someone processing a parking ticket. "Congratulations," she said, sliding the paper across bulletproof glass. "You're now the proud owner of Widow's Peak." The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she was offering condolences instead of congratulations. I folded the deed into my jacket pocket and walked out into the September heat, where Scout was waiting in the truck with his head hanging out the window. He's a German Shepherd mix with anxiety issues and the kind of eyes that see trouble before it announces itself. Found him 3 years ago outside a gas station in Nevada, all ribs and mistrust. We've been moving together ever since. "Well, boy," I said, scratching behind his ears, "looks like we're homesteaders now." Scout gave me the look he reserves for my worst decisions. He's got excellent judgment. The drive to Section 16 took 45 minutes on roads that got progressively more theoretical. Paved highway gave way to gravel, gravel to dirt, dirt to something that might have been a trail if you squinted and believed in optimism. The GPS lost signal somewhere around mile marker 7. My phone followed suit 10 minutes later. That's when I saw the first sign. It leaned against a cedar post like a drunk against a lamppost, weathered grey as old bones. Someone had burned letters into the wood with what looked like a branding iron, "Turn back or be taken," below it. In smaller text, "By order of Dolores County Mining Authority, 1987." Scout whined in the back seat. "It's probably just old mining warnings," I told him. "Unstable ground, toxic runoff, that sort of thing." But my hands were shaking as I put the truck in park. The mountain rose ahead of us like a broken tooth against the sky. Not particularly tall, maybe 8,000 feet, but sharp, angular. The kind of peak that looked like it had been carved with malice aforethought. The timberline cut across its flanks in an uneven scar, and above that nothing but scree and shadow. I checked the deed against my hand-drawn map. The property lines were marked in red ink, encircling the entire peak from base to summit. 40 acres that somehow included an entire mountain. The kind of mathematical impossibility that happens when government computers argue with government surveyors and everybody loses. The trailhead, if you could call it that, was marked by another post. This one had a rusted lockbox bolted to it with hardware that had seen better decades. A thin cable ran from the box to an eye bolt screwed into the cedar, like someone had chained it there to prevent theft. Which raised the obvious question, who steals lockboxes in the middle of nowhere? I got out of the truck and walked closer. The box was military surplus, olive drab paint flaking off in scales. No lock on the hasp, but it had been wired shut with enough rusty steel to stop a casual browser. The kind of security that suggested someone really didn't want the contents examined. Scout jumped down from the truck bed and immediately started bristling at empty air. "What is it, boy?" He tilted his head toward the mountain, ears pricked forward like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he took 3 quick steps backward and pressed himself against my legs. That's when I heard it. Laughter, high and sweet, like children playing. But there were no children up here. No people at all, according to the county records I'd studied. The mountain had been abandoned since the mining crash of '92, when the last company pulled out and left their equipment to rust in the weather. I stood still and listened harder. The wind moved through the cedars with a sound like whispered warnings. Somewhere higher up, a rockfall clattered down a slope I couldn't see. And underneath it all, that soft laughter, so faint I might have imagined it, might have. I walked the perimeter of what I could see, following survey ribbons that fluttered from branches like prayer flags. Most of the boundary markers were standard issue, aluminum stakes driven into the ground at regulation intervals. But every 100 yards or so I found something else. Gear, climbing gear mostly. A carabiner fused to a pine trunk with tree sap. A length of static rope braided around a boulder, like someone had been practicing knots and just walked away. A chalk bag hanging from a branch, still dusting white powder when the wind moved it. All of it weathered, all of it abandoned, all of it positioned like breadcrumbs on a trail I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. Near the eastern boundary, I found what I was looking for. A brass survey tag stamped into a piece of angle iron, driven deep into a crack in the rock. The metal was green with age, but the lettering was clear enough. Briggs, WP South, 1987 WP, Widow's Peak. And Briggs, that was a name I recognized from the county records. The surveyor who'd mapped this section for the mining companies, back when they still thought there was money in these hills. I pocketed the tag and checked my watch. 4:30 in the afternoon. And the shadows were already reaching down from the peaks like grasping fingers. Time to head back to town and figure out what I'd bought for $2. But as I walked back to the truck, Scout suddenly stopped and barked once, sharp and urgent. I turned to look where he was pointing. Higher up the slope, maybe 200 yards above the tree line, someone had built cairns. Stone markers, stacked with the kind of precision that takes time and patience. I counted 12 of them, arranged in a rough circle around what might have been a clearing. While I watched, one of the cairns shifted. Not fell, shifted, like someone had nudged it from behind. Then another, then a third. "Scout," I said quietly. "We're leaving, now." He didn't argue. I drove back down the mountain with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel and my dog pressed flat against the seat like he was trying to make himself invisible. The deed crinkled in my jacket pocket every time I hit a pothole, reminding me that I now owned something I didn't understand, something that might not want to be owned. That night, in my motel room in town, I spread the deed across the threadbare bedspread and studied it by lamplight. The legal description was standard bureaucratic double talk, but there were addendums, handwritten notes in margins, initials next to crossed-out paragraphs, the kind of amendments that happen when lawyers get nervous. One note caught my attention. Grantor claims no responsibility for structures, improvements or inhabitants found on premises. Inhabitants on 40 acres of abandoned mountain. I folded the deed and tucked it back in my jacket. Tomorrow, I decided, I was going to find this Briggs fellow and ask him some pointed questions about what exactly I'd bought for $2 and why everyone seemed so eager to sell. Etot Harlan Briggs lived in a workshop that had metastasized into a house. What started as a simple metal building had grown additions like tumors, a lean-to here, a shed extension there, all of it connected by covered walkways that suggested someone who'd spent a lot of time thinking about how to get from point A to point B without being seen from above. I found him hunched over a transit scope, adjusting tiny screws with the concentration of a watchmaker. The workshop smelled like machine oil and old coffee, with an undertone of something sharper. "Fear, maybe? Or regret, Mr. Briggs?" He looked up from the scope, and I saw eyes the color of winter sky. Hard eyes set in a face that had spent too many years squinting into distances other people couldn't see. "We're closed," he said. "I'm not here to buy anything. I'm Ruth Calder. I think this belongs to you." I set the brass survey tag on his workbench. The effect was immediate. His hands stopped moving, and the color drained from his cheeks like someone had opened a valve. "Where did you find this?" "On my property. Section 16, Township 9 North. Your property." He picked up the tag and turned it over in his fingers like he was reading Braille. "You bought Widow's Peak. It wasn't a question, for $2 at a county auction. Seemed like a bargain until I visited." Briggs laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. $2. Jesus, they're practically giving it away now. He stood up from the workbench and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner. The thing was massive, military surplus like the lockbox on the mountain. He pulled open the bottom drawer and rummaged through folders until he found what he wanted, a manila envelope, thick with papers. He dumped the contents on his workbench, photographs, survey sheets, and what looked like hand-drawn maps. All of it yellowed with age. "This is what I mapped in '87, he said. 43 separate claims, from the base to the summit. Took me 6 months to chart every tunnel, every shaft, every cave system in that mountain. I picked up one of the photographs. It showed the peak from the south face, covered in snow. Red X's had been marked over various points on the slope. "What are the X's?" "Bodies," Briggs said. "Climbers who didn't make it back down. We found 14 of them that summer, scattered across the face like broken toys. Some had been there for years." He pulled out another photo, this one showing a close-up of climbing gear. Modern stuff, aluminum carabiners, nylon rope, high-tech hardware. But it was all wrong somehow, twisted, melted. "Lightning strikes?" I asked. "That's what we told ourselves." He pointed to the gear in the photo. "But lightning doesn't do that. Lightning burns." This looked like something had digested it partially. I set the photo down carefully. "The mining companies pulled out after you finished the survey. They pulled out because of what I told them I found." He gathered the papers back into a pile, but his hands were shaking. "And then I burned the maps." "Why?" "Because some knowledge is too dangerous to exist." He walked to a propane burner in the corner and lit it with a match. The blue flame hissed in the silence. "Mr. Briggs, Harlan, I found climbing gear up there today. Fresh gear. And there are cairns on the slope that move when you're not looking directly at them." He turned around slowly. "You went up the slope?" "Just to the tree line. Scout wouldn't go any further." "Smart dog." He pulled a hand-drawn sketch from his shirt pocket and spread it on the workbench. "This isn't a map. It's a warning. Places to avoid. Routes that lead nowhere good." The sketch showed the lower slopes of Widow's Peak, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Triangles, circles, wavy lines that might have been contour markings or might have been something else entirely. What are the triangles? Listening posts, places where sound carries in ways that don't make sense. The mountain has acoustics like a cathedral, but all the echoes are wrong. And the circles. Graves, not marked graves. Hidden ones. He pointed to a cluster of circles near what looked like a gully. "We found some of the bodies there, but not all of them." I studied the sketch, memorizing the symbols. "You mentioned inhabitants in the deed addendum." Briggs went very still. "Did I? What did you see up there, Harlan?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blue flame of the burner. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small pewter whistle, tarnished black with age. "My brother Marcus found this in a cave near the summit. He was part of the survey crew. Good climber, better than me. He said he heard children singing up there, but there were no children, no families, no settlements within 50 miles. He held the whistle up to the light. There were marks scratched into the metal, tiny symbols that looked like the ones on his sketch. Marcus tested the whistle. Said it made echoes that lasted too long, in directions that shouldn't exist. The mountain answered him, Ruth. Answered in voices he recognized, but couldn't place. Where is Marcus now? That's the question, isn't it? He set the whistle on the workbench between us. He went up for one final survey run 3 days before we finished the project. Never came back down. I picked up the whistle. It was heavier than it looked and warm to the touch despite sitting in a cold drawer. The children's voices, I said. What did they say? Marcus wouldn't tell me exactly, but he kept a journal. Left it with me for safekeeping. Briggs pulled a leather notebook from another drawer. Last entry was the night before he disappeared. He opened the notebook to a page near the back. The handwriting was cramped, urgent. The mountain isn't higher than us. It's older. The voices aren't ghosts, they're heirs. Something lives in the acoustic shadows between the walls, and it's been waiting longer than we've been counting time. The whistle is a key, but I don't know what door it opens. God help me, I want to find out. I closed the notebook and handed it back. You think Marcus is still up there? I think Marcus found what he was looking for. Whether that's the same thing as being alive? He shrugged. That's above my pay grade. But you know I'm going back up. I know you're a fool if you do. Maybe, but it's my mountain now. Briggs studied my face for a long moment. Then he sighed and pulled a pair of bolt cutters from a rack on the wall. If you're determined to be stupid about this, at least be prepared stupid. He handed me the cutters, along with the whistle and his hand-drawn sketch. The lockbox at the trailhead has been sealed since '87. Marcus put something inside before his last climb. Maybe it'll help. Maybe it'll just get you killed faster. I tucked the whistle into my jacket pocket next to the deed. Why are you helping me? Because 35 years ago, I let my brother go up that mountain alone, and I've been wondering what happened to him ever since. He walked me to the door, moving like an old man despite being maybe 60. One more thing. Ruth, if you hear children laughing up there, don't follow the sound. Children are supposed to answer when you call them. The ones on Widow's Peak don't. I drove back to the motel with the bolt cutters rattling in the truck bed and Marcus Briggs' whistle warm in my pocket. Scout kept looking at me with those worried eyes, like he knew I was about to make another decision he couldn't support. It's just one more trip up, I told him, just to see what's in the box. He turned away and stared out the window. Even my dog knew I was lying. I waited until dawn to go back up the mountain. Something about approaching Widow's Peak in full daylight felt like wearing armor. Thin armor, but armor nonetheless. Scout rode shotgun with his ears flat against his head, resignation written in every line of his body. The morning was crisp enough to turn our breath into clouds. October in Colorado, when the air carries promises of snow and the light turns everything sharp-edged. I parked in the same spot as before and grabbed the bolt cutters from the truck bed. The lockbox looked smaller in daylight, less ominous. Just a piece of military surplus chained to a cedar post, like someone's idea of a rural mailbox. The steel cable that held it was orange with rust, and when I touched it, flakes came away on my fingers like dried blood. The bolt cutters made short work of the cable. It parted with a metallic snap that echoed off the slopes above us. Scout flinched and pressed closer to my legs. Inside the box, a coil of thin rope, bright yellow and obviously modern. Below that, a stack of laminated cards held together with a rubber band. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, a single folded sheet of paper. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I pulled out the cards first. They were index cards, covered in neat handwriting. Names and dates arranged chronologically. James Morrison, 1985. Last seen near Gully of Bones. Sarah Chen, 1986. Found climbing gear at 9,000 feet. Body never recovered. David Kowalski, 1987. Reported hearing children singing before disappearance. Maria Santos, 1988. Solo climber. Been found empty at base camp. 14 cards in total. 14 names, 14 dates, 14 people who'd walked into Widow's Peak and never walked back out. The last card made my stomach clench. Jonah Calder. 1989 surveyor found journal pages scattered near Summit Approach. Calder, my grandfather's name. My name? I opened the plastic bag with shaking fingers and unfolded the paper inside. It was a page torn from a field notebook, the edges ragged, like someone had ripped it out in haste. The handwriting was different from the cards, looser, more urgent. October 12th, 1989. The mountain isn't higher than us. It's older. I've been tracking the acoustic patterns for 3 weeks now, and the math doesn't work. Sound travels upslope in channels that shouldn't exist, following curves that violate basic physics. The children's voices are part of the system, not random sounds, but structured calls and responses. They're trying to communicate. I've carved listening marks into the stone faces, triangular cuts that catch and focus the echoes. The mountain has its own language, and I'm starting to understand fragments of it. The whistle Marcus found isn't just a tool, it's a key. When you blow it at the right elevation, facing the right direction, the mountain answers. Not with echoes, with new sounds, fresh sounds, children where none were born. If something happens to me, tell Ruth that the mountain knew her name before I did. It's been waiting for a Calder to come back. Jonah, I read the page 3 times before the words sank in. My grandfather had been here, had climbed this mountain, studied its acoustics, heard the same impossible laughter I'd heard yesterday, and somehow he'd known about me. Known my name decades before I was born. Scout whined and pulled at his leash. I looked where he was pointing and felt my breath catch. The cairns I'd seen yesterday had moved. Not fallen, moved. They were arranged in a different pattern now, closer together. More organized? Like someone had spent the night repositioning them into a more deliberate configuration. As I watched, one of the cairns shifted slightly, a single stone rolling from the top to settle against the side. No wind, no obvious cause, just movement. I pulled the pewter whistle from my pocket and held it up to the morning light. The scratched symbols on its surface matched the ones Harlan had drawn on his warning sketch. Triangles and circles and wavy lines that meant things I didn't understand yet. Without really thinking about it, I raised the whistle to my lips and blew. The sound that emerged wasn't what I expected. Not a sharp tweet, like a referee's whistle, but something deeper, mellower. A note that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. The mountain answered, not with an echo, but with a harmony. A chorus of voices, high and sweet, coming from a dozen different directions. Children's voices singing, in a language that sounded almost familiar, but just out of reach. Scout bolted. The leash jerked from my hand, and he was gone, racing back toward the truck like something was chasing him. I called after him, but he didn't slow down, didn't even look back, which left me alone on the slope with the children's choir growing louder. I walked toward the cairns, following a faint path that might have been a game trail or might have been something else. The singing continued, weaving around me like visible sound. I couldn't pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from the stones themselves, from the gaps between the rocks, from empty spaces in the air. Near the largest cairn, I found footprints in a patch of bare dirt. Small footprints, child-sized, but wrong somehow. The depth was uneven, like the person who'd made them had been walking on the balls of their feet, or had been carrying something heavy, or had been trying very hard not to leave clear tracks. I knelt and studied the prints more closely. 5 toes, human proportions, but the spacing was off, too wide apart, like someone learning to walk in shoes that didn't fit properly. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no bird calls, no distant traffic, just the kind of profound quiet that makes your ears ring and your heartbeat sound like thunder. I stood up slowly and looked around. On the far side of the cairn, circled maybe 30 yards upslope, a child was watching me. At least, I thought it was a child. The right size, the right general shape, but it was standing perfectly still in a way that children don't usually manage. And it was too far away for me to make out any details except the pale oval of its face. and the dark clothes that seemed to blend into the shadows. I raised my hand in greeting. The figure didn't wave back, didn't move at all. I took a step forward. The child vanished, not ran away, not ducked behind cover, simply wasn't there anymore, like someone had switched off a light. I blinked hard and looked again. Empty slope, empty sky, nothing but rock and sparse vegetation and the lingering sense that I'd been carefully observed. Behind me, Scout barked from the direction of the truck. Urgent, frightened barks that meant come back now in dog language. I looked down at the yellow rope still coiled in my hands, at the stack of cards with their catalogue of disappearances, at my grandfather's journal page with its impossible promise that the mountain knew my name. Then I looked back up the slope, toward the summit that waited like a question mark against the morning sky. "I'll be back," I said to the empty air, "tomorrow, with better equipment and a longer leash for my dog." The silence didn't answer. But as I walked back down toward the truck, I could have sworn I heard laughter following me. Soft and sweet and patient as stone. The kind of laughter that suggested someone was looking forward to seeing me again. Soon. I spent that night in the motel room with Jonah's journal page spread across the bedspread like a map to nowhere good. Scout had forgiven me for the mountain incident, but was keeping his distance, curled in the corner chair with his back to me. Dog psychology, 10-1. Ignore the human making bad decisions until she comes to her senses. The problem was, I didn't want to come to my senses. I'd bought a headlamp at the hardware store, along with a 100-foot coil of climbing rope and enough energy bars to survive a week in the wilderness. The clerk had given me the look reserved for flatlanders about to become cautionary tales, but he'd taken my money without comment. Now I sat cross-legged on scratchy motel carpet, studying the symbols Jonah had sketched in the margins of his journal entry. Triangular marks that he'd called listening posts. They were scattered across what looked like a rough topographical drawing of the upper slopes, connected by dotted lines that might have been trails or might have been something else entirely. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a circle with 3 radiating lines. Jonah had labelled it mouth in capital letters, positioned near what I assumed was the summit. At midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and drove back to the mountain. The road looked different in darkness, narrower, more twisted, like it was leading somewhere it hadn't led during daylight hours. My headlights carved tunnels through pine branches that seemed to lean closer with each mile. Scout whined from the passenger seat, but didn't try to bolt when I parked at the trailhead. Progress, I told myself. I'd brought a proper camping setup this time. Tent, sleeping bag, camp stove. If I was going to study Jonah's acoustic theories, I needed to be here during the hours when sound carries differently. Early morning, just before dawn, when the air is still and dense. The base meadow where I set up camp felt smaller at night. The circle of my headlamp made everything beyond it seem vast and hungry. I pitched the tent facing away from the slope, thinking that if something came down from the peak, I'd rather see it coming than wonder what was breathing on the back of my neck. Scout made a nest in the tent vestibule and settled into watch mode. Ears pricked, eyes reflecting my flashlight like amber coins. I pulled out Jonah's journal page and read it again by headlamp light. The more I studied his handwriting, the more questions arose. His reference to carved listening marks suggested he'd been modifying the mountain itself, cutting symbols into stone faces to manipulate how sound traveled. But why? What was he trying to hear, or what was trying to hear him? At 3 a.m, I found out. I'd been dozing in my sleeping bag when Scout's low growl brought me fully awake. Not his warning growl, his confused growl. The one he used when something didn't make sense according to dog logic. Outside the tent, footsteps circled our camp. Small footsteps, light and quick, like a child running through grass. But children don't run in perfect circles, and they don't run for 20 minutes without stopping or changing pace. I unzipped the tent flap an inch and peered out. Nothing. Just darkness and the sound of feet moving through meadow grass in a pattern that defied explanation. Around and around our camp, maintaining perfect distance, never getting closer, but never moving away. Then the singing started. High voices, young voices, weaving together in harmonies that made my skin crawl. Not because they were unpleasant, they were beautiful, heartbreakingly beautiful. But they were singing in empty air, with no bodies casting shadows, no breathing between verses. The melody was familiar, something I'd heard in childhood but couldn't place. A lullaby, maybe, or a counting song. The kind of music that gets passed down through generations until no one remembers where it came from. Scout pressed against my leg, trembling. I reached for the pewter whistle and held it up to the tent flap. The metal was warm again, almost hot to the touch. When I blew a single soft note, the singing stopped instantly. The footsteps stopped too. The silence that followed was so complete, it hurt my ears. Then, from directly above us, a child's voice said, "Are you Jonah?" I looked up through the tent's mesh ceiling. Nothing but stars and darkness. "No," I whispered. "I'm Ruth. Ruth Calder." Calder. The voice moved, circling overhead like the footsteps had circled the tent. "Jonah's granddaughter. He said you'd come." When did he say that? Before the mountain took him. Before he joined us in the listening places. My mouth went dry. Jonah is dead. Dead is a word for people who can't hear the mountain's voice. Jonah can hear everything now. I crawled out of the tent, still clutching the whistle. Scout followed reluctantly, pressing so close to my legs he nearly tripped me. The meadow looked exactly as it had when I'd set up camp. No footprints in the grass. No sign that anyone had been running circles around our tent for the better part of an hour. But carved into the boulder nearest our camp, carved deep enough to catch shadows from my headlamp, was a fresh triangle. One of Jonah's listening marks, cut into stone that had been smooth when I'd chosen our campsite. How? I asked the darkness. The child's voice came from a different direction now, somewhere upslope. He left instructions. "In the places where sound bends. We've been following them, cutting the marks he planned. We?" Laughter answered me. Multiple voices, multiple children, scattered across the mountainside like stars. But when I swept my headlamp in their direction, I saw nothing but empty rock and sparse vegetation. "Come find us!" they sang in unison. "Come find us where the mountain speaks." The voices faded, moving higher up the slope. Receding like a tide, I stood in the circle of my headlamp for another hour, waiting for them to return. But the mountain had gone quiet again, offering nothing but wind through the pines and the distant sound of rockfall. When I finally crawled back into the tent, Scout was already asleep. He'd stopped shaking, stopped growling. Whatever had been circling our camp, he no longer considered it a threat. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. Dawn came with a sky the color of old brass and air so still it felt solid. I'd slept maybe 2 hours, but adrenaline made up for exhaustion. Scout seemed oddly calm, like he'd made peace with whatever had visited us in the night. I packed light for the climb. Water, energy bars, the yellow rope from the lockbox, and Harlan's hand-drawn warning sketch. The pewter whistle went into my shirt pocket, close enough to grab quickly. The base of the climbing route started where the meadow met the scree field. Someone, Jonah probably, had built a cairn there. But this wasn't like the mysterious moving stones I'd seen before. This marker was solid, permanent, with a flat piece of slate wedged between the rocks. Scratched into the slate was a simple message. "Listen first." Pulled out the whistle and blew a soft, experimental note. The mountain answered immediately, not with children's voices this time, but with pure sound. Echoes that bounced between rock faces in patterns that seemed almost musical. Each whistle note I played came back transformed, harmonized, extended in ways that shouldn't have been possible given the terrain, but the echoes also served as a map. When I faced northeast and played a low note, the sound returned quickly, maybe 2 seconds. Solid rock, probably a cliff face hidden by the morning shadows. When I turned southeast and played the same note, the echo took longer to return and came back distorted, like it had bounced through a series of chambers, caves, or at least spaces where sound could travel and transform. I followed the echo patterns upslope, using the whistle like a primitive sonar system. Each note I played revealed something new about the mountain's hidden architecture. Gaps in what looked like solid stone, chambers that shouldn't exist, passages that connected in ways my eyes couldn't detect. Scout followed without complaint, though he kept looking back toward camp like he was memorizing our escape route. Halfway to the tree line, I found the first of Jonah's listening posts. It was carved into a granite face that caught the morning light, a triangle exactly like the ones on Harlan's warning sketch. But this wasn't just decoration. The triangle had been cut at a specific angle, positioned to catch and focus sound waves from the slopes above. When I stood in the right spot and blew the whistle, the carved symbol amplified the note and sent it racing upslope in a concentrated beam. The mountain responded with a cascade of echoes, each one revealing new details about the terrain ahead. A narrow ledge that traversed the cliff face, a chimney crack that might provide an easier climbing route, and somewhere higher up, the acoustic signature of a large open space, something that might be the mouth symbol from Jonah's drawings. Secured one end of the yellow rope to the listening post and started climbing. The route was easier than it looked, with plenty of handholds and solid rock. But it was also strange. Every few yards, I found pieces of climbing gear that didn't belong. A modern carabiner clipped to a crack where no climber should have been. A length of webbing wrapped around a horn of stone in a configuration that served no obvious purpose. All of it weathered, but not old. Placed recently, placed by someone who was still using this route. At the first ledge, I found proof, scratched into the stone with something sharp, a knife blade maybe, or a piece of metal, was a message, Ruth Calder. The mountain knows your name. Follow the cord below the message. Someone had driven a piton into a crack and clipped a thin cord to it. The cord led upslope, disappearing around a corner I couldn't see from my position. I tested the cord with my weight. It held, singing faintly in the wind like a guitar string. Scout barked from below, sharp and urgent. I looked down to see him standing at the base of the root, every muscle in his body rigid with attention. He was staring at something behind me, something on the ledge I couldn't see without turning around. I turned around. A child stood at the far end of the ledge, maybe 15 feet away. Close enough this time to see details that made my breath catch. She was maybe 8 years old, with dark hair braided with what looked like pieces of climbing rope. Her clothes were a patchwork of different outdoor fabrics, nylon from torn tents, fleece from abandoned jackets, canvas from old backpacks. All of it weathered but functional, all of it sized for a child who lived in the mountains. But her eyes were wrong, too old, too knowing. The eyes of someone who'd seen things that children shouldn't see. "You climb well for a flatlander," she said. Her voice was the same one I'd heard above our tent, but clearer now. "More present, thank you," I managed. "What's your name?" "Names are for people who need to be found." "We don't need finding, we live here." She pointed upslope with a hand that was missing the tip of one finger. "Jonah said you'd ask about names. He said to tell you that questions are more important than answers. Is Jonah alive?" Alive is a word for people who can still leave. Jonah can't leave anymore. None of us can. She started walking along the ledge, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent years navigating cliff faces. But he can still help, still guide. The mountain holds on to useful people. She reached the piton, where the cord was anchored, and unclipped a small object from her belt. A piece of slate, similar to the one I'd found at the base of the route. "He left this for you. Said you'd know what to do with it." She set the slate on a rock shelf and walked away, disappearing around the same corner where the cord led upslope. I secured myself to the anchor and crawled over to retrieve the slate. Scratched into its surface was a detailed drawing of the upper mountain, complete with route markings and symbols I was beginning to understand. The triangle listening posts, The circle caves where sound collected and transformed. And at the summit, the three-line symbol that Jonah had labeled mouth. But this drawing included something new, a dotted line that traced a route from the ledge where I stood to a position just below the summit. Not the most direct path, but one that connected all of Jonah's listening posts in sequence, a route that would let me map the mountain's acoustic properties from bottom to top. At the bottom of the slate, in Jonah's handwriting, a final message: the mountain sings to those who know how to listen. But first, you must learn its language. I clipped the slate to my harness and started following the cord upslope. The cord led me to a place that Harlan's warning sketch had marked with 3 overlapping circles. The Gully of Bones, where some of the missing climbers had been found, or at least where pieces of them had turned up over the years. It wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of a grim boneyard, I found something that looked almost like a shrine. The gully was narrow and sheltered, maybe 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. Someone had arranged the scattered climbing gear with obvious care, helmets lined up on rock shelves, prayer flags stretched between python anchors, coils of rope braided together into patterns that might have been decorative or might have served some purpose I didn't understand. At the head of the gully, a child's vest hung from a stunted pine tree, faded but still recognizable as something made for a real person. Someone small who'd needed protection from cold and wind. I climbed down into the gully and examined the gear more closely. Most of it was old, decades old, based on the obsolete designs and weathered materials, but it had been maintained. Cleaned, organized, treated with something that prevented rust and rot. Someone had been caring for these relics, keeping them functional long after their original owners had vanished. Near the center of the gully, I found what I was looking for, a film canister, the old-fashioned kind photographers used before digital cameras, wedged into a crack in the rock wall. Inside, a strip of negatives and a folded piece of paper. The negatives showed the same person in different poses, a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of tan that comes from spending time above tree line. He was grinning in most of the shots, chalk-stained, and obviously happy despite the challenging terrain behind him. I recognized the face from old family photos. Ruth Calder, my grandfather, documented in what were probably some of his last moments on the mountain. The paper was another journal page, this one more water-stained than the first. October 15th, 1989. I understand now why the mountain chooses certain people. It's not random, it's selective. The children I've been hearing aren't ghosts of the dead. They're heirs of the living. Kids who survived somehow when their families didn't make it back down. The mountain provided for them, taught them its acoustic secrets, gave them shelter in places that shouldn't exist. They've been building something up here. A network of spaces connected by sound, by echoes that carry information across distances that would take hours to traverse on foot. It's not supernatural, it's physics. Complex acoustics in a terrain that acts like a natural amplification system. The symbol I've been calling mouth isn't a place. It's a function, the point where all the mountain's echo chambers converge, where someone with the right tools could communicate across the entire peak system. The children want me to complete the network, to carve the final listening posts and test the full system. They promise they'll show me the way down afterward, show me routes that don't appear on any map. But I'm starting to understand that down might not mean what I think it means. I folded the journal page carefully and tucked it into my shirt pocket next to the whistle. The symbol from Jonah's. Drawings appeared throughout the gully, carved into rock faces and scratched into pieces of metal gear. The filled circle with 3 radiating lines repeated like a signature or a promise. I pulled out the whistle and tested it. The gully exploded into sound, not echoes this time, but harmonics. The narrow walls acted like organ pipes, turning my simple whistle note into a complex chord that seemed to have more voices than physics should allow. The sound bounced between the rock faces in patterns that created new melodies. New harmonies, new combinations that rang with crystalline clarity, and underneath it all, barely audible, the sound of children singing along. I played a sequence of notes, experimenting with different combinations. The gully responded to each one differently. Some notes creating cascading echoes that lasted for minutes, others producing sharp, focused beams of sound that seemed to shoot straight up toward the summit. On the third sequence, something answered back, a child's voice coming from somewhere deeper in the gully, singing the same melody I'd been playing, but with variations I hadn't thought of. Improvising, harmonizing, treating my whistle as the beginning of a conversation rather than a performance. I followed the voice deeper into the gully, past the arranged gear and memorial flags, to a place where the walls curved inward and the shadows grew thick. There, carved into the stone at head height, was the most elaborate symbol I'd seen yet. Not just the three-line circle, but a complex diagram that looked like a map of echo paths, with lines connecting dozens of smaller symbols across what must have been the entire mountain. And below the diagram, in fresh carving that still showed tool marks, a single word behind the carved welcome sign, hidden by an overhang that was invisible from the main gully, was a passage. Not a natural cave. This had been enlarged, shaped, modified by human hands over what must have been years of careful work. The walls showed chisel marks, and the floor had been leveled with flat stones, fitted together like primitive paving. I switched on my headlamp and followed the passage deeper into the mountain. The tunnel curved gently upward, wide enough for an adult, but low enough that I had to duck in places. Every few yards, I found more of Jonah's triangular listening posts carved into the walls. But these were different from the ones outside, more elaborate, positioned to catch and redirect sound waves that flowed through the tunnel like water through a pipe. The passage opened into a chamber that took my breath. A way someone had been living here recently. The room was maybe 20 feet across and high enough to stand upright, with natural light filtering down through cracks in the ceiling. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of supplies that spanned decades, old-style camping gear mixed with modern energy bars, hand-forged tools next to lightweight mountaineering equipment. But it was the walls themselves that made me understand what I was seeing. Every surface was covered with carvings, not random scratches or graffiti, but a systematic documentation of the mountain's acoustic properties. Echo maps, sound diagrams, mathematical calculations that tracked how voices traveled between different chamber systems. It was Jonah's research, continued and expanded by people who'd had years to explore every corner of the mountain's hidden architecture. In the center of the room, carved into the floor, was a perfect circle filled with concentric rings. When I stood in the center and spoke, my voice returned from a dozen different directions, each echo carrying slightly different inflections. It was like standing in the middle of a natural mixing board. With each ring corresponding to a different audio channel, you found it. I spun around, heart-hammering. A boy stood in the passage entrance, maybe 12 years old, wearing the same patchwork clothes I'd seen on the girl. His hair was white blonde, bleached by sun and altitude, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who'd spent years working with stone and metal. "Found what?" I asked. "The listening room." "Jonah's masterpiece. He spent 3 months mapping the acoustics before he figured out how to carve it properly." The boy walked to one of the stone shelves and picked up what looked like a piece of chalk. "Want to see how it works?" Before I could answer, he drew a symbol on the wall, one of the 3-line circles. Immediately the room filled with sound, voices coming from everywhere and nowhere, children talking and laughing and singing in a complex symphony that seemed to have no beginning or end. "We're all connected," the boy explained. "Every listening post, every chamber, every tunnel. Jonah designed it so we could talk to each other across the whole mountain without leaving our rooms. How many of you are there? Depends what you mean by us. Kids who live up here full-time. Maybe 8 or 9. But the network reaches people who don't even know they're part of it." Climbers who find the listening posts and start using them. Rangers who hear voices in the echo chambers and think they're going crazy. Jonah said the mountain collects useful people, whether they want to be collected or not. I thought about Harlan, about his burned maps and his refusal to talk about what he'd seen. About the climbing gear I'd found, placed by people who were using routes that weren't supposed to exist. What happened to Jonah? The boy was quiet for a moment, studying the carved symbols on the walls. Then he walked to a niche I hadn't noticed before and pulled out a sealed envelope. He left this for you. Said someone with his name would come looking eventually, and when they did, they'd need to understand what they were choosing. The envelope was addressed in Jonah's handwriting. Ruth Calder. If the mountain lets you in. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was dated 3 days before Jonah's disappearance. Written in the careful handwriting of someone who knew his words might be the last communication he'd ever make. Ruth, if you're reading this, then the mountain decided to let you in. That means you're family, and it means you have a choice to make that I couldn't make for you. The children aren't ghosts. They're survivors. 3 years ago, there was a mining accident in the old shaft systems. Not the big collapse that closed the operations, but a smaller cave-in that trapped a group of migrant families who'd been living in the abandoned tunnels. The rescue crews never found them because they didn't know to look. The families had been squatting illegally, staying out of sight, raising kids in spaces that weren't supposed to exist. When the shaft collapsed, most of the adults died. But the children survived, and they learned to use the mountain's acoustic properties to avoid the search parties that might have separated them. Put them in foster care, scattered them across the system. They've been living up here ever since, building a network of safe spaces connected by sound. Smart kids, Ruth. Ingenious kids. They've turned this mountain into a home that protects them. I've been helping them improve the system, carving listening posts and mapping echo chambers to make their communication network more reliable. But there's a storm coming, literally and figuratively. The county wants to sell mineral rights, and the new mining company has better equipment than the old one. They'll find the children's hiding places within a month of starting operations. Harlan knows. He's been helping too, though he won't admit it. When his brother Marcus disappeared, it wasn't because the mountain took him. It's because Marcus discovered the children and chose to help them hide. Harlan burned his maps to protect their locations, but he's been carrying the guilt ever since. The children need an adult advocate, someone with legal standing who can protect their claim to this place. Someone who owns the mountain. You own it now. Ruth. The question is what you'll do with that ownership if I don't make it down from this last mapping run. Tell the children I'm sorry I couldn't finish what we started. The storm system moving in is going to destabilize some of the echo chambers. They'll need new safe routes to higher ground. The summit chamber, the one I marked as mouth, is the key. It's where all the acoustic channels converge. If you can reach it and complete the mapping work, you can give them a communication system that will keep them safe no matter what happens below, but only if you choose to. No one can make that choice for you. Love, Jonah P.S. Tell Harlan his brother would be proud of him. I folded the letter with hands that weren't entirely steady. Outside the listening chamber, wind was beginning to build, and the acoustic properties of the room shifted as air pressure changed. The carved symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with the storm's rhythm. He's right about the weather, the boy said. He'd been waiting patiently while I read, but now his voice carried urgency. Big system moving in from the west. The lower chambers will flood, and some of the echo paths will go dead until it passes. How long do we have? Maybe 6 hours. Maybe less. He pointed toward the ceiling, where the filtered daylight was taking on the grey-green tinge that comes before mountain storms. We need to get everyone to the high chambers before the wind gets too strong to climb safely. I thought about the pewter whistle in my pocket, about Harlan's warning sketch with its careful notations of dangerous areas, about 8 or 9 children who'd built a life in spaces that shouldn't exist, who'd learned to survive by listening to echoes and trusting in acoustics that defied conventional understanding. "Where's the summit chamber?" I asked. The boy smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "You want to see the mouth? It's about 2 hours up if you know the routes. But the storm's going to make it dangerous. More dangerous than letting the system fail during a flood." "No," he admitted. "Not more dangerous than that." He led me to another niche and pulled out a coil of thin rope, the same type as the yellow cord from the lockbox. "This is Jonah's safety line. It connects all the high-altitude listening posts. If you follow it and don't let go, it'll take you straight to the summit chamber. What about you? What about the other children? We know the safe routes. We'll get to the high chambers and wait for you to complete the network." He handed me the rope, and I could feel it vibrating faintly in the wind. "But if the storm hits before you finish the mapping, don't try to come back down. Stay in the summit chamber until it passes. The acoustics there will let you talk to us, let us know you're safe." I clipped the rope to my harness and checked my headlamp batteries. Outside, the first drops of rain were beginning to tap against the stone. "One more question," I said. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then grinned. "Marcus. My grandfather was the surveyor who helped map this place. Harlan's brother. The man who disappeared into the mountain 35 years ago. Who'd chosen to stay and help rather than return to a world that wouldn't understand what he'd found." "Tell your grandfather," I said, "that Harlan kept his maps secret all these years. Kept the children safe," Marcus nodded. "He knows. The mountain keeps us all connected. The rope led me up routes that existed in defiance of gravity and common sense. Handholds carved into seemingly blank rock faces. Ledges that were invisible until you stood on them. Passages that connected cliff systems in ways that required faith more than skill. Jonah's listening posts marked the route like breadcrumbs, each one positioned to catch and redirect the acoustic signals that flowed through the mountain's hidden architecture. The storm was building with each 100 feet of elevation I gained, but the carved triangles sang in the wind, creating harmonics that helped guide me even when visibility dropped to arm's length. Halfway to the summit, my radio crackled. "Ruth, this is Harlan. You up there?" I pressed the transmit button, shouting over the wind. "I'm here. About 1,000 feet below the summit. Storm's worse than forecast. You need to get to shelter now. I'm almost at the summit chamber." Jonah's letter explained everything, Harlan. About Marcus, about the children, about why you burned the maps. Static filled the channel for a long moment. "Then Marcus is alive. His grandson is. They've all been living up here, Harlan. Your brother started something that kept those kids safe for 35 years. Jesus." Another pause. "The county commissioners are meeting tomorrow about the mining lease. If you're going to protect that mountain, you need legal documentation of what's up there." "I know. But first I need to complete Jonah's acoustic network." The rope led me to a narrow chimney that opened onto the summit plateau. The wind up there was strong enough to knock me sideways, but the plateau was larger than I'd expected. Maybe an acre of relatively flat stone, dotted with cairns that hummed in the wind like organ pipes. At the center of the plateau, carved into the stone itself, was the largest listening post I'd seen. Not a simple triangle this time, but a complex spiral that descended into the rock like a natural amphitheater. The famous mouth, the convergence point where all the mountain's acoustic channels came together. I rappelled into the spiral and found myself in a chamber that defied description. The walls were covered with carvings, not just Jonah's triangular listening posts, but symbols from every person who'd contributed to the mountain's hidden network over the decades. Children's drawings mixed with engineering diagrams, mathematical equations carved alongside simple messages of hope and determination, and in the center of the chamber, a natural formation that looked like a massive pipe organ made of stone. When the wind blew across the summit, the formation sang with voices from every hidden chamber in the mountain. Children talking, laughing, calling out positions and weather updates. In the coded language they'd developed over years of practice, I pulled out the pewter whistle and added my own voice to the chorus. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every child in the network answered at once, their voices creating harmonies that made the chamber ring like a bell. They were calling positions, confirming safe arrival at high chambers, reporting on storm conditions across the mountain. They were also saying goodbye to Jonah. I could hear it in the way they sang his favorite melodies, in the respectful silence that followed each mention of his name. They knew he wasn't coming back from whatever final mapping run had taken him deeper into the mountain than anyone could follow. But they also sang welcome songs for me, songs that included my name, my grandfather's research, my choice to continue work that could have ended with Jonah's disappearance. Songs that recognized the legal protection I could offer, the adult advocacy they needed to keep their mountain home safe from mining operations and government oversight. As the storm reached its peak, I made my decision. The storm lasted 18 hours, but the summit chamber kept me connected to the children throughout the entire event. I used Jonah's acoustic maps to help coordinate their movement between safe rooms as water levels rose and fell, relaying weather updates from my radio to locations where normal communications couldn't reach. By the time the wind died and I could safely descend, I understood what I'd inherited, not just 40 acres of mountain real estate, but responsibility for a community that had learned to survive in spaces between the official world and the wild one. Children who'd built something remarkable from loss and necessity, who'd turned acoustic science into a tool for freedom. I made it back to the lower chambers as the sun broke through the clouds. The children were already busy repairing storm damage, clearing blocked passages, retuning listening posts that had been shifted by rockfall, testing echo paths that might have been changed by the weather. Marcus met me at the entrance to the main chamber, grinning despite the exhaustion that marked all their faces. "Network's still solid," he reported. "Lost 2 of the eastern echo paths, but we can reroute through the gully system. The high chambers stayed dry. What about the mining lease?" "Arlen took care of it. Filed papers with the county yesterday, documenting your ownership and your intention to establish a conservation easement. The mining company withdrew their application this morning. I pulled out the waterproof mapping sheets where I'd recorded the complete acoustic network during the storm. "These are yours," I told him. "Copies of everything Jonah mapped, plus the new routes we tested during the storm. But they stay in the mountain. No names, no faces, no information that could compromise anyone's safety." Marcus nodded and carried the sheets to a stone archive where dozens of similar maps were stored. Decades of accumulated knowledge about how to live safely in spaces that weren't supposed to exist. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you staying?" I thought about that question as I walked back toward the trailhead. About the motel room in town, about the job I'd left in Denver, about the rootless life I'd been living before a $2 deed changed everything. At the lockbox, I hung a new sign. Not a warning this time, but an invitation for the right kind of person. "If you hear laughter, listen, then leave the way you came unless the mountain decides to keep you." Below that, I installed a weatherproof container with copies of Jonah's acoustic maps and a simple message. "Take a map if you need guidance. Leave no name if you value privacy. The mountain protects those who protect it." Scout was waiting by the truck, tail wagging for the first time since we'd arrived. He'd spent the storm with Harlan in town, probably eating better food than he'd seen in months and sleeping on furniture instead of tent floors. "Well, boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "Looks like we're homesteaders after all." He gave me the look that meant he approved of this decision, even if he didn't understand all the reasons behind it. I filed the conservation easement paperwork that afternoon, establishing legal protection for acoustic habitat preservation across the entire mountain. The language was carefully vague but legally binding. No mining, no development, no interference with the natural sound properties that made Widow's Peak unique, the county clerk stamped the documents with the same enthusiasm she'd shown for the original deed. "Transfer. Congratulations," she said. "You're now the legal guardian of a mountain. This time," she said it like she meant it, That night, camped in the base meadow with Scout curled against my side, I heard the children's choir drifting down from the listening chambers. They were singing new songs now, welcome songs for a neighbor who'd chosen to stay, teaching songs for an adult who'd agreed to help them protect. Their hidden world, songs that included my name among the mountain's permanent residents. I owned 40 acres of Colorado, mountain for $2, and it had turned out to be the bargain of a lifetime. Not because of mineral rights or development potential, but because some inheritances are worth more than money. Some things are worth choosing, even when the choice means leaving the normal world behind. The mountain sang me to sleep with voices that promised safety, community, and the kind of home that exists only in the spaces between what's possible and what's necessary. In the morning, I would start learning the children's coded language, mapping new acoustic routes, and figuring out how to be the kind of adult advocate they needed. But tonight, I just listened to them sing, and finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to tell me in his journal. The mountain isn't higher than us. It's older, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it decides to make you part of its story. I'd been chosen, and I'd chosen back. That made all the difference. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.